beautiful.
I have no doubt. Yeah.
All right. Be careful what you say, because we're now being live streamed, my friends.
So David, are you in the city, or are you the
I live on the Upper West Side.
Queens guy, or what?
I'm from Brooklyn originally. I'm a Brooklyn boy, but I live on the Upper West Side. I went to Columbia for college, and I've been on the Upper West Side on and off ever since, except for the 10 years in LA. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. We need to.
Do we have New Yorkers in this group, or is everyone? Is
we have
New Yorkers. My mother was from New York.
I see.
Originally Connecticut.
Ah, okay.
My mother always said she could speak very rapidly because she was from New York City.
Well, we do move a little bit more quickly.
All right, a few more minutes, one more minute, and we'll start. I can see that we've been joined by more people. And just so everybody knows, we are recording live to YouTube. If you do not want to be recorded, you can turn your camera off. I know some of you have security clearances and can't be recorded. So just, all right. Hello, everybody. Good Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome. Of course, this is our Jean Klein Scholar in Residence weekend, and we have a fantastic scholar for you all. Dr. David Kaufman, who is a scholar and teacher of Jewish history and American Jewish studies. He has his BA from Columbia College and MA in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and a PhD in American Jewish history from Brandeis University. So he's jumped around. He has taught at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, at the University of Southern California, at Hofstra University. He is the author of numerous articles and has written some books, two of which are Shul with a Pool, the Synagogue Center in American Jewish History, and Jewhoing the 60s, American Celebrity and Jewish Identity. He is currently living in New York, and he is developing a public history resource center called New York Jew Center for New York Jewish History. Today, he is going to be talking to us about history and memory in the Jewish experience, an overview of Jewish history viewed through the lens of the history of memory and dichotomy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce him. Before we begin, let's of course say the blessing for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. It's always a thrill to meet new communities, a new congregation. I've been asked to do two talks for you, and tomorrow's will be on my my last book, which is about popular culture. It's about American Jewish life. It's a kind of a popular topic in that regard. But today, for in the spirit of Shabbat, I wanted to do something a little broader, a little more related to the sacred, let's say. And so what I'd like to do is introduce you all to my general field of Jewish history. I know it's subject many people have quite interested in, but I wonder to the degree to which people are familiar with the academic field of Jewish history, and that's what I want to represent today. You might think of it as a kind of the way a rabbi in a sermon will do a drash on the Torah portion. What I'd like to do is a drash on another text. For me, it's a sacred text. And that is a very important book that came out in the 1980s, written by a very prominent Jewish historian named Yosef Hayim Yerushalmi. He was the great Jewish historian at Columbia University for many years, having replaced the even more famous Selo Baron prior to him. But in 1982, Yerushalmi, who, by the way, I mean, he sounds like he's an Israeli, he's a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx, right? He Hebraizes his name at some point. Yosef Yerushalmi writes ZAKHOR, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. And this book caused quite a splash in the academy mostly, and I'm never quite certain to the degree to which it's more widely known, and that's why I'm sharing it with you today. What Yerushalmi did in this book was to make the point that Jews from the very beginning have been focused on remembering their own past. The collective or communal memory of the Jewish people is a central part of the Jewish experience and what it means to be a Jew. I think he points out that in the Torah, the divine commandment, thou shalt remember, occurs 60, 70 times. I forget the exact number, but something like that. That commandment is repeated again and again. Thou must remember where you come from, that you were that you were brought out of Egypt on eagle's wings and the like. And that injunction to remember is there again and again. And yet, Yerushalmi points out, despite that key element of Judaism, Jews throughout our long history have, until the recent past, have almost never gone into the field of history. We have very few historians amongst us. The exception proving the rule was the great Josephus Flavius of the first century, was a major figure in general Roman history and in Jewish history of that time. But then after Josephus, there will then pass a good 15 or so centuries until we have anyone else who attempts to research and write the history of the Jews. And so what Yerushalmi is doing, first of all, is to create a kind of dichotomy between what in Judaism we cherish and honor as memory, where we came from, who we are, reading our Torah, which is our memory book, essentially, versus what Yerushalmi and people like myself mean by the term history. What we mean is the academic and scientific study of history. And that's been, once again, that has a very short history. It's only, let's say, the last 200 years that we Jews have been generating such a literature of historiography of the historical experience of the Jewish people. It's a new phenomenon. So to give you an example of what I mean by this divide, this dichotomy between history and memory, the best example is one you're all familiar with, and that's the story of Hanukkah, right? We all know that Hanukkah is one of our favorite holidays. Everyone knows something about it, but to apply the history-memory divide is to recall that there are two very different explanations given for why we celebrate Hanukkah in the first place. What is Hanukkah about? So the history perspective is, well, there was somewhat of a Jewish civil war that took place in the 2nd century BCE between Jewish traditionalists and Jewish Hellenists, those who were more assimilated. The Greek rulers get involved, and ultimately the civil war becomes a rebellion against them, and the rebellion is won, and the Greek rulers are defeated, and their occupation of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem is ended. And we retake the temple, we rededicate it, and then thereafter ensues a period of about a century of Jewish rule under the Hasmonean dynasty. So Hanukkah historically is the product of that, originally a civil war that results in Jewish rule, Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel. There's much more we could say, but contrast that with the traditional explanation for Hanukkah. Centuries later, the rabbis of the Talmud would say, why do we have Hanukkah? And their answer was that God provided a miracle whereby there was not enough oil to light the lamps in the temple. Again, you all know this story. what was only enough for one day lasted for 8 days, and that's the miracle. And therefore, we celebrate an 8-day holiday. That's a good example of memory, because it is not only ahistorical, it never happened, but more importantly, it's the story we tell which gives meaning, which provides inspiration, which establishes Hanukkah as a sacred event. It relates the holiday and therefore the Jews to God in that moment. And that's what memory does. And that's why I said earlier that our Torah is essentially a book of memory. That is the book of memory. But history oftentimes comes into not direct conflict necessarily, but offers a different perspective. And so what I'd like to do today is, again, building on Yerushalmi. I should just tell you that Yerushalmi ends his book on a kind of a down note. He spells out this duality between history and memory in great detail, beautifully written. I highly recommend it. But in the end, he kind of says, you know, in the end, history, what I've devoted my life's work to, the study of Jewish history, in the end, you know, the Jews ain't buying it. I mean, what he really concludes is that memory has won the day. And if there is any kind of competition between these two perspectives, memory is the winner. And therefore, a professional Jewish historian feels a little bit like a voice in a wilderness to whom no one is paying much attention. So it's a bit of a lament. It's a bit, the Yiddish term is a geschrei that Yerushalmi is offering to complain that no one's listening to me and to those of us in the academy who are studying and teaching this extraordinary field of Jewish history. But I think we can be a little less cynical, a little less pessimistic. And what I'd like to argue is that both Jewish history and Jewish memory both serve a purpose. They're both important ultimately. They both have worth. And it's simply a matter of harmonizing and finding some balance between them. I think the first way to balance is by giving them different names, right? If you call the miracle of the oil, if you call that history, then it's in conflict with another version of history. But if you call it memory, and then the other is history, then they're not in direct conflict, right? They're two different categories. They're two very different ways of telling our story and remembering our past. What I'd like to do, this is a class I teach. When I teach Introduction to Jewish History, I use this as a lens to talk about the entire historical experience. And we don't have time today. But what I'd like to do with you is apply this, again, this dual lens to 4 major themes in Jewish history. And at least for the first few, I will make the case that both history and memory serve a very important purpose, and there's no reason not to retain both of them. And as modern Jews, and I taught in the Reform movement, your Reform temple, we are by definition modern and Jewish, right? That's in our DNA. It's in our nature to strike a balance between these two. So what is the first theme? The first theme is simply the major theme of Jewish history. Jewish history is the history of the Jewish people, our identity as a people, the understanding that Jews constitute a kind of a nationality, an ethnic culture, if you will, is the first, major theme of Jewish history. That notion, different words have been applied. Peoplehood has come into popularity in the recent period. There was a time when the word nation was often applied to Jews. Even in the late 19th century, Jews themselves sometimes called themselves a race, right? At that moment when racial anti-Semitism was emerging, Jews themselves used that language. So whatever word is in fashion or makes sense to you, they amount to the same thing, that Jews constitute despite the fact that they're dispersed all over the world, they constitute a single group, a people, a nationality. Where does that come from? Well, the origins of the people, the Jews, is what's of issue here. And let's look at the memory history divide. What does memory tell us? Where do the Jews come from? Who were the first Jews? What are the origins of the Jews tells you about the nature of the group? So according to our memory, according to our Torah, there was a first Jew, right? God communicates with Abraham, enters into a covenantal relationship with Abraham, and thereby Abraham becomes the first Jew and the progenitor of all Jews to come. He is our founding father. And of course, his wife Sarah is our founding mother. Their children are also patriarchs and matriarchs, but Abraham in particular has come to be thought of as the original Jew. It's something we were all taught in Hebrew school. Who was the first Jew? Abraham. Now, that is terrific in that it gives us a very powerful sense of Jews being an extended family. We are a descent group. We all, whether it's fully accurate or not, doesn't matter. It's the idea that we all descend from Abraham, and therefore we are all related. We are all family. That's an important part of Jewish peoplehood. And then equally important is that by virtue of being in covenant with God, Abraham is the precedent for all Jews thereafter. What does it mean to be a Jew? It means to be in berit, covenant, covenantal obligation to and relationship with the divine. That too is a very important part of that memory of where the Jews come from. It's why we will always teach that Abraham was the first Jew. He is the quintessential role model for what it means to be a Jew, right? However, the historical version of this is a little bit different. And as we know from modern social science and history and anthropology and the like, peoples, national groups do not originate with one person. Religions do, right? The Jewish religion may have originated with Moses, if not Moses, then certainly with Ezra, the scribe, was someone who was a key figure in bringing this religion to life. Certainly Christianity, Jesus and Paul, those are individuals who founded a religion. Islam was founded by Muhammad, without question, right? So religions begin with one person, but a people develops in a very different way. Think about the American people. Who was the first American? Could there be such a thing? No, because a people comes into being more gradually and over the course of time, and is an incremental change of group identity. So when there was a group of British colonialists who thought of themselves as such, over the course of a few centuries, begin to think of themselves in a new light. They begin to apply the name American to who they are, and the American people comes into being as a kind of a shift of identity. And that's true of all peoples. All peoples come into being in such gradual incremental fashion, and it's true of the Jews as well. And so what modern day historians and archaeologists have determined is that the original Jews were descendant of an earlier group called the Israelites. It was the Israelites who wrote the Torah and so forth. The Israelites, being the proto-Jews, emerged according to the archaeological record. It disputes the version in the Torah, which is that they become Israel by virtue of coming out of slavery in Egypt and conquering the land of Canaan and so forth, right? That's the memory of who the Israelites were. But the archaeological record has begun to tell a very different story. And this, by the way, is only over the last 50, 60 years. This is relatively recent, these findings. And this is a good example of what I mean by the academic historical approach. This is what biblical scholars and biblical historians are steeped in. What I'm about to say, it doesn't get out to the world all that often. And that's why I'm thrilled to be able to be here this morning to share this sort of thing with you. According to the biblical archaeology, the Israelites were originally Canaanites. They were local indigenous people of Canaan. Their material culture was identical to other Canaanites living around Canaan. But one group of those Canaanites, the ones living up in the highlands of what we today call Judea, that area, those Canaanites begin to separate themselves and develop a separate identity over the course of time. Now, what caused that, what prompted that, may have certain connections to the biblical narrative, but that doesn't matter for now. What I want you to contemplate here is the notion that Jews derive from Israelites who derive from Canaanites. In each case, it's a shifting of identification, how the group understands itself, sees itself. Oftentimes, that's largely determined by its memory. What are the stories it tells of its origins? But from our point of view, we see those original Israelites as a separatist group of Canaanites who will then begin to develop their own separate culture. And just to give you one detail there, one of the I suppose charming details of that story is that in the ancient Israelite villages that have been excavated, again, the ones that have the same material culture as the Canaanite villages, one difference that was found was in the garbage dumps of these two villages, of the highlands and the lowlands. The ones in the highlands, those who became Israelites, there were no pig bones in those garbage dumps, whereas the garbage dumps down below have plenty of pig bones. That's to say, the Canaanites up on the hill, for whatever reason, stopped eating pork. And that's likely a precursor, a precedent of what will later evolve into the laws of kashrut. But it's that kind of lifestyle change that can oftentimes provide the divide between different groups. So, very different way of describing the origins of the Jewish people. And I'd like to suggest to you that if the story of Abraham gives us certain values and certain ideas of ourselves, this historically based one roots us in history, roots us in that land, and normalizes us in a way that I think is also very helpful in terms of thinking about what it means to be a Jew, that it plugs us into world history in a way that fits, in a way that makes sense, and parallels other peoples and other national groups elsewhere around the world. I think there's great value in that, rather than only thinking that we are God's chosen, right? Okay, so that's the first theme. Obviously, there's much more we can say about the Jewish people, but I want to do each of these themes in succession, and then I hope afterward we'll have questions and a lively conversation to follow. The second major theme, second key element of the Jewish experience is Torah, is that we organize our lives by a book or a series of books, and those books have become holy, sacred to us. And they, in fact, form, the 5 books of Moses in particular, form the foundation of all of the religious tradition to come. So Torah is absolutely central to the Jewish experience. Again, I'm sort of stating the obvious, but here too, there is a history-memory dichotomy, which is pretty sharp, pretty clear. And that is that, according to memory, as the Torah itself describes, the Torah was given to the Jews by God through the intermediary of Moses on Mount Sinai. That's to say, the Torah, the book we're talking about, is divine revelation. It is the word of God. How do we know that? The Torah says so, right? The key phrase here that Orthodox Jews will often use is that Torah is Sinai, Torah Sinai. The Torah comes from Sinai. In other words, it comes directly from God on high. That's the memory. And I should add that later on, there's a kind of a second iteration of that notion of divine revelation that will be added centuries later, right? The Torah is composed in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries BCE. 1,000 years later, when the era of the Talmud, the ancient rabbis come around, they will actually add a new wrinkle to the notion of revelation, and they will suggest that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he didn't only receive the books that he will then write down as what we call the written Torah, but in fact, according to the later rabbis, Moses also will receive an entirely other Torah, much bigger, much more extensive than the written Torah, that will be only the al peh, verbally, and the oral Torah. And Moses comes down from Sinai with he has the written one that he puts into writing, but the oral one he will pass on orally to Joshua, and Joshua to the members of the Great Assembly, and the members of the Great Assembly to the early rabbis, and so forth. So it's passed down. It is the oral tradition of the rabbis, was given on Mount Sinai. And therefore, everything that we rabbis are now writing down in the form of Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud, Midrash, all of rabbinic literature is not something we came up with, we rabbis, but it's Torah. It was given to Moses. It comes directly from God. So this notion of Jewish text as being divine revelation is not just about the 5 books of Moses, the original written Torah, but it applies to all of Jewish learning. And that will continue in perpetuity. All of Jewish learning derives from God on Sinai. Every rabbinic teaching, every sermon, every class. I mean, there's a wonderful comment in one rabbinic source that even the question that some bright yeshiva student will someday ask his rabbi, even that question was given by God on Mount Sinai. Again, that's the concept of oral Torah. It's a beautiful, powerful, extraordinary concept because it brings our tradition to life. By studying our Torah, by delving into it, by immersing ourselves in it, we are wrapping ourselves in the divine. We are encountering God in every moment of study and engagement with the Torah tradition. This is Judaism. Who on earth would ever want to get rid of that? It's so extraordinary how I think, one of the questions that historians are often asked is, how did the Jews survive for so long through the centuries in dispersion, oftentimes oppressed? How did the Jews survive? Well, one good answer is that there's something very special about their tradition, and it is the idea of Torah. Now that's memory, right? Everything I've said so far is the Jewish memory of where Torah comes from. As you probably know, in the last few hundred years, there has emerged a form of what's called higher biblical criticism, which has suggested a theory. It's called the documentary hypothesis of when and in what way the text of the Torah was composed, and then ultimately, and obviously the documentary hypothesis is that there were 4 major source texts signified by the letters J-E-P-D, the one that uses the word for God, Yahweh, the one that uses the word for God, Elohim, or J and E. P is the priestly document, and D is the Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history. Those are the 4 major sources. There are variations of this, but this is now universally accepted that the Torah was in fact a collage of prior documents. And more to the point, we also have begun to zero in on in what particular setting was each document composed, and even by who, by what kind of group of priests, or even in some cases, there's a theory that there was a woman author of one of them. So we're beginning to get closer, as close as we can get, to the actual composition of this literature. And that's obviously a very different point of view from the traditional notion of Torah Missinai, but the documentary hypothesis and the historical understanding of where Torah comes from, once again, I want to suggest to you, is very full of insight, pregnant with insight. There, so much of what we now understand about the Torah is enabled by this historical perspective. So it's not only useful in how it helps us think about Jewish history, but in reading the text and interpreting the text, which is the Jewish activity par excellence, the documentary hypothesis, the historically rooted approach, is enormously helpful as well. And it's one of the reasons that we have something called modern Judaism. Judaism as a religious tradition has taken tremendous strides and made tremendous progress in the last few hundred years. Something called Reform Judaism, for example. There's Reconstructionist Judaism, there's Conservative Judaism, there's Jewish Renewal, et cetera, et cetera. This is all within the last century or so. And it was enabled by this historicizing of the Jewish past and of the Torah tradition. So again, we could talk for much longer about the implications of the historical view of the composition of the Torah. But the point I'd like to drum on is that both serve a purpose. Both the notion of Torah Missinai, the sacred origins of our Torah, are extremely important for us as Jews and for the continuity of Judaism, and the historical understanding of where these texts came from and who wrote them and when and under what circumstances, also extremely important in helping us better understand our own tradition. So those are the first two themes. The first was people, the second is Torah. The third is a little bit more of a secular theme, and that is the theme of diaspora. As you well know, the Jews originated in a homeland called Israel, various other names as well, but very early in their history began to live outside of the land of Israel and yet retained their identity as Jews, right? The word Jew is a shortened form of Judean, someone from Judea. So as Judeans moved away and moved to Rome and Greece and North Africa and Asia Minor and other parts of the world, they retained this identity as people of Judea. They came to be known as Jews. And life in what comes to be known as, using the Greek term, it was a Greek-speaking world, the Hellenistic world, living in diaspora, living in dispersal from homeland, becomes a norm for Jews throughout most of their history. Something you may have learned in Hebrew school was that it was following the destruction of the temple in 70 CE that the diaspora really comes into being. It predates that. There was probably a majority of Jews living outside the land of Israel as early as the Hellenistic period, or the period of the Maccabees, for example. But certainly the diaspora becomes the majority experience of Jews for the remainder of history. And even to this day, when we now have returned to the land of Israel, as you're all aware, there is still a majority of Jews living outside. That's about to change, by the way. Demographically, there will be more Jews living in Israel in the next few decades than living outside. But still, there's still a major diaspora that exists. Now, what is the history and memory element here? Well, according to Jewish memory, oh, and by the way, what's really intriguing here is that both the historical perspective and the memory perspective are both to be found in the Torah. So what is the memory perspective? The memory perspective is, we have been exiled from our land and we're now homeless. And how can we sing a song of God in a foreign land? And what's to become from us, right? You hear my voice is one of lament. And the most famous such lament is a psalm that was composed during the time of the Babylonian exile. You all know it. I remember by the waters of Babylon, where I sat and wept. Why was I weeping? And by the way, it's interesting that it's in the past tense. It's very likely that that psalm was written by someone who returned to Jerusalem and was writing in retrospect about that terrible experience, that interim period of living in Babylon. There we sat and wept. How can I sing a song of the Lord on foreign soil, right? That notion that diaspora is exile, is the Hebrew term is galut. You might know the Yiddish term golus. Galut, golus, exile are all very negative in their salience. They are, the Jewish tradition talked about this as being a punishment of God. Why are Jews cast out of their homeland and into exile? It was punishment for their sins. So there's something sinful, or sinfulness is built in to the experience of galut, of exile. And there will be Jewish commentary on this for centuries and centuries. It becomes part of the Jewish psyche, part of Jewish self-understanding, that living in galut is somehow a degraded state. And when the Messiah comes, we'll all return to our normal, healthy state of living in our own state, right? So that negative twist on diaspora is the memory. Jewish tradition continually reminds us that we are, even though we live in diaspora, this is not ideal. This is not where we really ought to be, right? That's the memory. The historical takes a somewhat more neutral view of diaspora. It doesn't have a kind of pejoratory term for it. And it, in fact, is simply the Jewish condition, good or bad, for centuries and centuries. It is enormously varied. Some diasporas are good, some are bad, some are comfortable, some are not. But diaspora in and of itself is not a punishment of God, but rather a critical aspect of Jewish history. And in fact, it has been argued that not only is it not negative, but it can often be a positive. Right? One trope I'm sure you've heard is that it's been said all of the great Jewish contributions to civilization have been made in diaspora. Right? That was before we had a Silicon Valley in Tel Aviv today. But prior to that, historically speaking, the diaspora experience for Jews has been extraordinarily generative, productive, creative. Much of the history of Judaism comes out of the diaspora. But more to the point, the Jewish engagement with other cultures has more often than not been generative, productive, positive. There's a famous article written by the Jewish historian named Gerson Cohen, who was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary for a while. But the title of the article was "The Blessings of Assimilation." Because again, from the memory point of view, Jews lament, we live in Galus and our children are not going to be Jews any longer and Jews are assimilating, they're leaving the fold, right? I mean, we all have those thoughts and feelings from time to time. Gerson Cohen gave a classic speech in which he reminded his listeners that the diaspora has very often been a place where Jews have, by virtue of adapting to those circumstances, new forms of Jewish life have emerged, and much of a positive nature has developed. And so I would refer you to that article, but simply that's a historian's take on diaspora, which in a sense is the obverse of the Jewish traditional take on it. So again, history and memory offer two very different perspectives. I said before, they're both in the Torah. So the Psalm by the waters of Babylon is the memory, but in the book of Jeremiah, who was a contemporary, there is a very famous letter that Jeremiah, who's living in Jerusalem as a prophet, as a Jewish religious sage, writes a letter to the exiles in Babylon, in the great city of Babylon. And this letter has been incorporated into the book of Jeremiah, and therefore it's in the Bible. And that letter says to them, as long as you're there, settle down, build houses, build families, contribute to the society of which you're a part. Right? Always remember who you are, but make the best of it. Was the prophet Jeremiah's recommendation. Now that recommendation has been taken up by millions of Jews throughout history who have in fact settled down and contributed and adjusted. And that's a key theme of Jewish history as well. And what in this case, we have the tension between the two attitudes already in the Torah. It certainly has played out in Jewish life and Jewish consciousness throughout our history. Okay, so that was the third. And now my fourth and final is a theme, is a little bit more contentious, perhaps, in terms of how to balance the two. And I'll tell you right off the bat, I'm not even certain that this one lends itself to balancing. I think there may be, in this case, there may be a preference for one over the other. And that is the theme of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is, it'd be nice if it were not a part of Jewish history, but unfortunately, it has been a part of our historical experience for a very long time. It arises, it's worth rehearsing the history of anti-Semitism just briefly. It arises first in the diaspora. And what do I mean by anti-Semitism? I mean a vicious, irrational, vitriolic attack on Jews accusations against Jews, ideas about Jews that are sinister and quite hateful. Those ideas and the attacks that occur as the result only emerge in the diaspora experience, when Jews are living in foreign cities, and yet they, in order to preserve their Torah and their tradition, they maintain a separate community. So there's a kind of Jewish separatism that occurs. And then from early on, Jews, since they are a diaspora people, they're also oftentimes engaging in commercial pursuits, as any diaspora people does. And so very early on in their history, they tend to become somewhat successful economically. So Jews are both keep separate as a community, and they are conspicuously successful. That's a fact. That's a historical truth. Other people seeing that, other members of those societies seeing that, it would have been nice had they come up with a rational historical explanation for what they saw, but human nature is such that they often came up with a nastier explanation. And that is, the Jews are keeping separate. It's because they hate humankind. They are misanthropes. The Jews are doing well. It's because they're getting special privileges. It's unfair. They're manipulating the levers of power in their benefit. Those kinds of accusations are the basis of classic anti-Semitism, and it emerges very early on in the diaspora. It's interesting to note that there's no real anti-Semitism in the Bible, according to history. I'll come back to the memory in a moment. But the first episode in the Bible that could be called anti-Semitism takes place in the diaspora, and that is the story of Purim. Haman, as the archetypal original anti-Semite, was in a diaspora community of Persia. So that conforms to what I'm suggesting to you, that anti-Semitism is a product of the diaspora. But let's do the memory and history, because here there's a fairly sharp divide between them, not as easily reconciled. Memory, Jewish memory, in other words, the Jewish religious tradition, which is what informed our understanding of our past for most of our history until the modern period, right? So Jewish memory will look back to the Bible. And there was one very brief episode in the desert sojourn of the Israelites where they are attacked from behind by another nation called Amalek. And according to the rabbinic commentators, Amalek thereby becomes the prototypical Jew-hating enemy, the eternal enemy of the Jews. Eternal because, from a religious point of view, there's no before or after in the Torah. It's all happening, over and again throughout time. So the attack by Amalek was something that would then reverberate and repeat again and again through history. So when the Haman story is written, Haman is identified as a descendant of the king of the Amalekites. Haman is an Amalekite. Skip ahead to the modern era when we are confronted by the greatest, worst anti-Semite in history, a man named Adolf Hitler. Jews in Europe will say, aha, once again, it is Amalek come back to attack us and vilify us. The Jewish historical memory of anti-Semitism is that it runs throughout our history, throughout our experience. It is eternal. It is simply ever recurring. It keeps repeating. And it is a kind of an independent force transcending history that is greater than any historical variation or specific circumstances. Anti-Semitism has this kind of eternal, independent phenomenology. That's the way we tend to see it in Jewish tradition. Another good example of that is the rabbinic statement. There is a famous rabbinic statement in the Talmud that says Esau hates Jacob. Esau are the non-Jews of the world. Jacob is the Jews. And the statement was simply that non-Jews hate Jews, period. End of story. It's fixed. It's permanent. It's a fact. Now, that is the Jewish historical memory of anti-Semitism. Briefly, one problem I see with that is that, well, if it is eternally, kind of divinely ordained, God created anti-Semitism in a certain sense, then how can we ever fight it, combat it, defeat it, mitigate it even, right? In other words, it's beyond us. That's one problem with it. But let me share with you the historical, which is very different. I already gave you a little bit of the historical view to suggest the ways in which anti-Semitism emerges out of diaspora circumstance. But again and again, what will happen is that Jewish life, the presence of Jews, will be anomalous in one way or another. Non-Jews seeing them will not have a way of understanding what they're looking at. And the explanations they come up with will devolve into a form of anti-Semitism. I'll give you another example. During the 1st century CE, in the Roman-ruled land of Judea, there were lots of religious sects and variations of Judaism. There were Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and all sorts of sects we don't remember. One of them we do remember, and that was a very small little sect called the Jesus sect. Now, Jesus certainly existed. He certainly had followers. But what is less often remembered is that there were at that time millions of Jews living around the Mediterranean and in diaspora who never heard of Jesus. It was this obscure, religious guy in Judea. There was no internet, there was no mass media. Most Jews never heard of him, number one. Those who did hear of him in Judea, by and large, weren't interested. They weren't buying. Most Jews rejected Jesus in his time. And throughout history, most Jews have continued to reject Jesus, not believing that Jesus was the Son of God and the Messiah and the Savior and so forth. So there is this basic fact of history that Jews, by and large, do not accept Jesus as their Christ, as their Savior. That's just a historical fact. Now, from an enlightened point of view, modern day Christians understand pluralistically that different strokes for different folks. Different people have different religions. Not everyone is going to accept Jesus. Fine. In history, however, it was not so easily, the pluralistic attitude wasn't so available because after all, Jesus was God. How can you not see that? How can you not accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? And if you don't, there must be something wrong with you. That idea that there's something wrong with you develops a story. The first one is that it was the Jews who conspired to kill Jesus. Later on, of other versions in the Middle Ages, other versions will have it that before the holiday of Easter, which coincides with the Jewish holiday Passover, Jews would kidnap a Christian child to drain their blood to make their matzah. Right? These are insane ideas about Jews, completely divorced from reality, that are an early form of anti-Semitism, that Jews killed God, or that they kidnap a Christian child, either one, and those two are related. But in both cases, they derive from an underlying truth. And that truth is that the Jews don't buy Jesus. So anti-Semitism, from a historical point of view, is historically contingent in that it emerges from historical circumstances and actual social, political, economic conditions. Jews being a separate community is an actual condition. Jews not accepting Jesus is an actual condition. What is then layered on top of that is the anti-Semitic irrational fantasy, which unfortunately has a basis, an underlying foundation that is truthful. It's one of the reasons anti-Semitism is so persistent and pernicious and so difficult to fight. However, once we analyze it in such a way, once we historicize it, once we understand what it means to say it's historically contingent, we begin to have the tools to more effectively combat and confront it. And so here, in my fourth theme, as you can hear, I'm quite passionate on the subject of how important it is to approach the growing threat of anti-Semitism in our own time, how important it is to approach that rationally, and that means historically. And I'm not sure what the Jewish memory, what I left out, of course, is that living, it's now about 80 years since without any question, the worst outbreak of anti-Semitic hostility in all of history was just 80 years ago. We call it the Holocaust, and we are living in its wake. And we are deeply affected, and I would suggest even traumatized, by the fact that it was not that long ago that 1/3 of our people were wiped off the map of the earth. I mean, how traumatizing is that? And so our understanding, and that has now become a major part of Jewish memory, is Holocaust memory. So once again, we so often respond to any new outbreak or new expression of anti-Semitism as if there's another Holocaust about to occur. And my friends, that is ahistorical. I teach the Holocaust, I teach anti-Semitism, and one thing that has to be understood is that we are not living in 1930s Nazi Germany. The context, the setting is very, very different for all sorts of reasons. And those, without going into those reasons, that simply represents the historical perspective. So I would ask you and all of my fellow Jews to confront this new scourge of anti-Semitism. Has to be taken seriously, no question, but to do so with perspective. And here, I guess, it's funny, I've sort of been trying to spell out this theme of the importance of balancing history and memory. I have yet to fully come to an understanding of how the memory of anti-Semitism, what role that might play. Maybe I might be missing something. And I'll just end with one, a former a great historian at Brandeis University named Simon Ravidovich, back in the 50s, post-Holocaust, wrote a book entitled it was originally an article, or a book entitled The Ever-Dying People, by which he meant that Jews in every generation think they're the last, think the Jews are dying out. Again, it's that kind of gestrei. What's going to be the next generation? And so that is something he identified as a Jewish habit of mind that he traced back throughout Jewish history. It's a good example of Jewish memory. And he gave it a function. He said that it serves a purpose. That ever-dying idea serves to light a fire under our tuchus, to get us to take the necessary actions to make sure that we will have continuity into the future, to build the Jewish schools, to develop the programming, to have the kind of leadership, to rethink and reconceptualize Judaism in a way that will make it living and ongoing and so forth. So from Ravidovich's point of view, that the memory of anti-Semitism can serve an important purpose. And so I guess that's the answer to my question, that it does sometimes reignite our Jewish identity and pride and commitment. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, in this moment of fighting anti-Semitism, I don't believe that's our first line of defense. So maybe that's the subtle distinction. And with that, I will end my sermon for this morning. Again, tomorrow's talk will be very, very different, very much more contemporary and the like, but I hope that this was stimulating in some way, and I look forward to your questions and our conversation.
Okay, folks, there are two ways of asking questions. One is you can type them into the chat and I will relay them. The other way is for you to put up your hand if your camera is on, and I will definitely call upon you to ask questions. And Cal, if you could unmute yourself, please, and ask your question. Cal, you're muted.
You're still muted, Cal.
Okay. So my question to you is, there are many peoples through the millennia who had a sense of identity and had history and had memory. and most of them disappeared. They got merged into, assimilated into other people. They got killed off. And could you talk about the distinction? So you said memory is one of the or a major reason why that didn't happen to the Jews. But I'd like you to expand on the difference between Jewish survival over the millennia and the disappearance of other peoples. There's the Greeks that are still here, but the Greeks now bear no relationship to the Greeks during the time of Macedonia and Alexander Greek. The same Italians are here now, no relationship to the Romans who ruled the West for centuries. So could you speak to that?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. It's an essential question. My first thought would be that when you say the Greeks of today are not the same as the Greeks of then, the same is true of the Jews. If you're speaking in terms of genealogy and DNA and the like, we've been reshaped and created over the course of time. What is the continuity between Jews today and Jews then? What does link us is the text, is the Torah, right? We are a people by virtue of that Torah. And once again, the Torah is the book of memory. So that's what I meant earlier by saying that it is memory that provides the answer. But I want to answer you in a different way as well. It's always the great question. How have the Jews survived? What has enabled this extraordinary record of survival through the ages? I think one reason that modern Jews like us are concerned with it is that at some level, we're looking for a substitute for the older doctrine of chosenness. For much of our history, when we thought of God in the traditional terms of, the creator of the universe, the king of the world, right, sitting on high, and God had chosen the Jews as his holy people, right? That and for many Orthodox traditional Jews today, that might be the answer to your question, right? How are we survive? Well, because we're God's chosen people. I think a better sort of an obvious, but worth pointing out, a better way of stating that or phrasing it is that it's the Jewish memory of being God's chosen people. It's the Jewish self-understanding as being a chosen people that has infused them with raison d'etre and a sense of destiny and purpose, and has kept them going. Now that's I think a better way than the traditional, like literal way of, well, we're God's chosen people. That's how we've survived. I think you'll agree that it's more accurate, it's more helpful to state it in terms of, well, that's what the Jews believed, and that's what then helped them to survive. Having said that, I would then want to add a number of other factors, and that is that whereas other peoples have had a diaspora experience, the Jewish experience of diaspora is lengthier and wider than any other group I can think of. And therefore, in again and again adapting to those circumstances, and that means, in certain sociological terms, it means Jews became the urban people par excellence, because if you're constantly on the move, you're not moving to become a farmer in the countryside, you're moving to become a merchant in the city. Right. And so again and again, Jews move in that direction. And so over the course of time, they develop certain cultural survival mechanisms having little to do with their religious tradition, which also speak to this question of survival. So I would want to certainly give due to the let's call it the religious explanation for Jewish survival, but there are others as well, other historically based reasons as well, which go to Jewish economics, Jewish politics, Jewish communal patterns, Jewish family patterns. All these things add up to a recipe for survival. And I think it's fair to say that Jews have been history's experts in surviving as a group outside their homeland. You may know the Dalai Lama, who was exiled from Tibet, brought to his center in India a group of Jewish rabbis and other Jewish scholars to ask them that question. What do you know that we don't know? Right? What is the secret of the Jews? So I just want to ensure that we're thinking of it as something more broad-based than having any one particular explanation.
Bill,
Yes.
if you would like to unmute and
It's
ask your question.
it's a similar question to Cal's, but slightly different.
Okay.
Other peoples have memory and history, as Cal said, and modern Greeks say we invented democracy, whatever. How is the Jewish use or misuse of history and or memory different from other people, if it is?
Again, thanks for continuing to pull the thread, because you're right. There's a lot more there. I think it's fair to say that the Jewish tradition, as constructed largely by the rabbis, was a tradition which ritualizes and institutionalizes memory. The best example being the Passover Seder, right? Our most popular holiday, right? The Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur are not really the high holidays. Pesach is really our high holiday, correct? In terms of popularity, in terms of meaningfulness, right? On a folk level for most Jews. So what is Passover? Passover is a memory fest. Passover is a ritualized way of bringing a family together at home to share this communal sense of Jewish memory. Next year in Jerusalem, right? My father was a wandering Aramean. This is the story told again and again, year after year. And by the way, Shabbat does this as well. It's not just Pesach, right? Shabbat is a commemoration both of God's creation of the world and of God's liberation of the Jews, right? So obviously it could not be more central, more intrinsic to the Jewish tradition. And to your point, I think that if we want to pat ourselves on the back, which is perfectly fine, I think we Jews have done a quite extraordinary job of making memory our lifeblood, of making it the nature of our religious experience. It informs it on so many levels, in so many ways. We are the world's leading experts on making memory meaningful and vital. And that's why someone like Yosef Yerushalmi felt so frustrated toward the end of his life. I spent my life teaching history and Jews aren't interested, right? Because they've got this extraordinary tradition of memory. I have tried to argue today, and I still believe that both are good, that there's a balance to be established.
Laura.
So again, Bill, I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask you is that why do you use the word memory? Did you think about using any other word for this whole concept? And I must say that in Reform Sunday School, they were very successful in telling me that all of these memories were our history and how important they are. But did you think about using a different word like legend?
Well, I mean, the word I thought you were going to suggest was myth, right? Because these are in the same way that the myths of the ancient Greeks become their religious, worldview, their mythology. That's what we're talking about. I think the word myth has certain negative connotations. It wasn't my choice to use the word memory. Yerushalmi was building on a growing discourse at the time, and there are now journals entitled History and Memory. The word memory has become the accepted term to contrast with history, and it doesn't matter what word you use as long as it's not history, right? In other words, as long as you're not confusing the two, as long as we maintain that distinction and understand that in the same way that no one believes that Adam and Eve are historical figures, right? It therefore doesn't matter. So interestingly, as we move through the Torah, the question of historicity becomes more and more of issue, right? So most historians assume that Moses is largely a legendary figure. I mean, obviously based on something historical, but much of what we know about the patriarchs, and then even Moses and Joshua, is more legendary than historical. So the question is, when do we get into more reliable history in the Torah? And that's the monarchy. So David and Solomon are kind of the dividing line. The later kings, there's no question, they're all and the prophets, all historical figures. And we can learn a lot about them from the text, even though the text was not written as history, but it is written at a time much closer to when they lived. Right? The dividing line in terms of scholarly debate is King David and King Solomon. Those are the ones where there's still pretty sharp debate. Right?
But it's just interesting which word was accepted.
Yeah, I mean,
so
do you not like
thank you.
the word
You've
memory
answered. Yeah, thank you. That's fine.
Is the word memory a problem for some reason? Or?
No, but it's interesting that that's what.
So, but again, my main answer is, as long as you don't confuse it with history, use any word you want. Okay.
Hal, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Before the destruction of the temple, it was the second temple. It was the center of Jewish life. And the form of Judaism was very different, as I understand it. Jews didn't connect with God except through the temple and so forth. It was a hierarchical structure, annual pilgrimages if you really wanted to connect. My question is, if the second temple was not destroyed, would Judaism have survived? And the thesis would be that the destruction of the second temple led to a reinvention where Torah became the central point, and rabbinical Jews arose, where rabbis taught, or teachers, to inspire people to adhere to Judaism. Would Judaism have survived had the second temple not been destroyed?
Well, it's a great question. Let me first recommend a book by a colleague of mine named Gavriel Rosenfeld. He's a professor in Connecticut, but he's currently also the director of the Center for Jewish History here in New York City. And Gavriel recently edited a volume of the what ifs of Jewish history. So if that's an angle that you like, I would highly recommend that book. Obviously, if the temple had not been destroyed, the history of Judaism would be different. It quite clearly spurred the rabbinic movement, and what we now call traditional Judaism is, for the most part, rabbinic Judaism. So, it goes without saying that the history and development of Judaism would have proceeded very differently. But what I would add to your narrative is that prior to the destruction of the temple, you already have in the Jewish world a multiplicity of Judaisms, right? There is no one mainstream, one authoritative Judaism. There is a competition between Pharisaic and Sadducean and the Essenes and sects like the Jesus sect, right? That's the nature of Judaism in first century Judea. And in some sense, they are all, you can understand the variety of them in terms of how they each relate to the temple. In other words, the temple is that divisive factor. So the group that's most aligned with the temple and it as the primary institution, that's the Sadducees. They are a priestly sect of Judaism. And for them, it's very temple-centric. The Essenes are the ones who were the most oppositional to the temple. They not only are they anti everything the temple represents, but they can't even bear to live in Jerusalem. They get out of town. They go off to the desert to live in Qumran and places like that, and develop their own separatist Judaism. And then there's kind of the in-between group are the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, while they give some degree of respect and homage to the temple and its system of ritual and so forth, they also are in the process of developing a more home-based, more populist, kind of a democratic form of Judaism, that where the sacred, the locus of the sacred is shifted from the temple to the personal altar, being the dining room table in one's home. Right. So they are the ones who begin that system of personal blessings and rituals that will become central to rabbinic Judaism. So when the temple is destroyed, it will be the Pharisees who will emerge as the ones who have the best recipe for what ought to replace it. But to your point, I wanted to emphasize that 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 melange of different Judaisms that was taking place while the temple still stood. So again, I hope that addressed your concern.
Darla and Jim, one of you have a question.
Yeah, so I think I have an elementary kind of question, but I'm really enjoying your seminar. But in terms, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting. That was the passing down of an oral Torah and a written. So, and it calls to mind an exercise we probably all did as kids, where you would sit around in a circle and the first person would tell a story, and then it would go to the next one to reinterpret it. By the time when it came around to the last person, it was nothing like what happened in the first person.
Right.
So I guess my question is, how do you look at the oral tradition, which probably is subject to change as it passes down?
Yeah.
And what people will say, the oral tradition will not ever be static until it's written. So I'm just wondering how you kind of blend that together.
Well, I mean, I don't blend them together. I'm describing another group, the rabbis who did that. And it's a remarkable thing. And it's also an open question to the degree to which they took their own theory seriously. In other words, did they actually literally believe that what they were teaching and what they were discussing was actually given by God? I don't believe so. I think it was the principle of it was that there is divinity, there is revelation in this moment of Torah study. That Torah study is that revelation was not a fixed text that was the opposite of the kind of fluidity you're talking about with the telephone game. It is constantly changing. What the innovation of the rabbis was to suggest that kind of fluidity, that kind of open-ended creativity was divine revelation. Divine revelation wasn't just a fixed text. And again, it's a brilliant concept. I don't think it's widely understood by many, if not most, modern Jews today. It's unfortunately more the province of the traditional world, the Orthodox world. But what it does is it keeps our tradition a living one. It is an open-ended one. It is never-ending. And the process of our engagement with Torah is never-ending, and that's what God intended. That's God's imprint. Is that fluidity? So, again, I hope I'm not further confusing you, but I would recommend if you want an article to read on this. There's a classic article by Gershom Scholem. Gershom Scholem was the great scholar of the Jewish mystical tradition, and he has a classic article entitled "Revelation and Tradition as Categories of Judaism." So, revelation being, in his words, that's what actually happened on Sinai, right? That's the written Torah. And then tradition being this ongoing, continuing to develop tradition of Torah discourse. These are two key categories. The rabbis called the second one the oral Torah. And so that
wrote
would be
that down. I appreciate that. My husband is sitting next to me, and I only raised one hand. Can he ask a question, Rabbi? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Jim.
I'd like to ask,
let me get him to show his face.
given the intermarriage rates in America, anyhow, very, very high, up to 70% by some Pew polls, and generally the lack of participation in most communities with synagogues. How do you feel about the future of Jewry? You're kind of indicating that it lasts forever, no matter what happens. But it seems to me the trends are all negative.
Well, that's a big topic. Maybe you'll invite me back another time to speak, on that issue, that question of Jewish continuity and the like. Let's see. How shall I answer? I think you're right. You're right to suggest that as a historian, I'm temperamentally optimistic about these sort of things. The more aware you are of the length and the continuum of Jewish historical experience, the more confident you'll be that we're not about to disappear overnight. It's not to say that the trends you suggested are not challenges; they certainly are. But let me suggest to you that the interfaith issue in particular, the fact that it's not only that 70% of Jews are marrying non-Jews, it's what it then means in the wake of that. More Jews in America are living under the same roof with non-Jews than ever before in Jewish history. The children being raised in those homes are a new phenomenon. What does it mean to be raised by one Jewish parent, one non-Jewish parent? Again, these are still relatively new trends. What I see is that they have already begun to affect this question of Jewish peoplehood. Now, there is the understanding of what Jews are, which historically was a worldwide people with a common past and a common destiny and a common culture of some kind, right? That's what makes a people. For much of our history, that was our self-understanding. That was the way people saw us from outside. More and more nowadays, we are shifting toward an understanding of who is a Jew according to religion, right? So the peoplehood is on the decline. The peoplehood value, let's call it, is on the decline, and the notion of Jews as a religious group is on the rise. I see that as one effect of the intermarriage rate. I would be, which by the way is problematic, right? What does that mean in terms of our relationship to Israel? What does it mean in terms of our relationship to Jews elsewhere around the world if we're not one big extended family, if we're not a people, right? But then the other question is how does it affect Judaism? And in the same way as a moment ago, I was suggesting that the destruction of the temple certainly changed Judaism, but in retrospect, it might have given it a little zest, a little catalyst to recreate, reinvent, and renew itself. There's a very good possibility that we're in the midst of that kind of historical transformation of Judaism at the moment. I think Judaism is in the process of changing. I think, as has always been the case, most of those changes are quite creative. There's a dynamic sense of new possibility, new forms of Jewish life in Judaism. I just attended a panel discussion the other night at my synagogue about the Jewish future, right? And the panelists were three rabbis. I felt a little miffed. Why don't they have a historian up there too? But it was three rabbis, right, talking about the Jewish future, and they were relatively positive because from their point of view, Judaism is adaptable and creative and dynamic, and Judaism always finds a way to renew itself. So on that level, I would feel a little more sanguine about the future. What it means for Jewish group identity is another question. Again, I'm not sure in answering these questions that you're opening such big cans of worms that I could talk about.
Yeah, that's good. That was good.
I'm trying to give you a pithy answer.
Let me call on Bob. Bob, if you can put your camera on, that would be great. If you can't, I understand. But would you like to ask a question?
I'd like to know all about the dog in the background.
That is, well, first of all, on the wall, that the subject for tomorrow's talk is my last book called Jew-hooing the 60s, which profiles 4 Jewish celebrities of the early 1960s, Sandy Koufax, Lenny Bruce, Bob Dylan, and Barbara Streisand. So far, as an adult, I've owned 2 dogs, and then my last dog was named for Bob Dylan. His name was Zimmy, and this guy is named for Koufax. His name is Kofi. So both to answer your question and to introduce tomorrow's talk.
I love that because we were talking before you all came on. The historian names his dog after historical figures, and the rabbi names her dog after rabbis. So, there seems to be a trend here. There's a comment from Cal in the meeting chat, and I don't know if you want to comment on it yourself. He writes, Jewish tradition was mostly codified by the rabbis with the Mishnah and Gemara. When Qumran was excavated, the parchments found they were in many respects very similar, identical to parts of the Torah. The Masoretic text was codified around the year 1000 and has remained the same. So this codification has kept traditional Judaism a very strong central focus to keep it very similar to what it has been over the centuries. I'm not sure if there's a question that comes out of that, but do you want to comment on his statement?
Well, two things. One is there is a similarity between Judaism and Islam in that both of them are textual traditions, which have a basic foundation and then continue to elaborate upon that. And so there's a real similarity. I had another thought about that. It just left me for a moment. I'm sorry, I just had a little brain.
That's okay. We're all of that age where that happens. Yeah. We totally get it.
It'll come to me. Well, I'll tell you something else. I mean, it's worth comparing the relationship between. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. That the question specified Mishnah and Gemara being the Talmud. What's often left out of that is the rabbis had another genre of literature that they were engaged in that adds up to something even bigger than the Talmud, and that is Midrash. Right? Midrash is much more in conformance with this oral Torah tradition being imaginative, being creative. It was their interpretive gloss on the Torah narrative, filling in the gaps, adding stories, telling him. Probably the best known example is the story of Abraham toppling the idols in his father's idol shop. Right? That's not in the Torah. That's from the rabbinic midrash. That's rabbinic elaboration that comes much later. And so much of Judaism, so much of Jewish teaching derives from the midrash. That's something I don't know if there is a direct parallel in Islam. Certainly not in Christianity. That kind of venue or opportunity for the religious thinkers to be creative, to exercise their literary, imaginative capacities. So the Midrash is really an extraordinarily important part of the Jewish religious tradition, the rabbinic tradition. And I just want to make sure that's in there as well. And then as long as you mentioned Islam, it's always worth pointing out that the relationship between Judaism or Jews and Muslims and Jews and Christians is one that there's obviously it's a major issue in the history of anti-Semitism, in Jewish history. But one key point I would make is that, and it goes to memory, right, is that whereas the Christians also adopting what they call the Old Testament prior to their New Testament, right, they read our Torah, they project themselves into it by identifying themselves with Jacob, with Israel. They are the new Israel, right? Which is called supersessionism. The Christian reading of our Torah kind of bumps us out of it and replaces us with them. The Muslim reading also, they have the Torah. They're reconstituting a new religion to some degree on that basis. They don't read themselves into Jacob. They see themselves in Ishmael. So the Jews are still Isaac. They are also children of Abraham because it's Ishmael who's the progenitor of the Arab peoples. And therefore, from the Muslim reading of Judaism is not supersessionist, but is one of sibling connection and relationship. So it's one reason that historically our relationship to Islam was most often much better, much friendlier than with Christianity. And I think it's an important distinction to be drawn.
So in the chat, Bill Saganic suggests that the role of the hadith in Islam is similar, though not identical.
Right, well, hadith is the equivalent of halakha, right? So hadith is a law. So the legal tradition of Islam parallels our legal tradition of halakha. So yes, by all means. That's why I added the thing about Midrash. To my knowledge, there is nothing nearly to the same extent in Islamic tradition that would be comparable to the Midrash. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on Islam. My HUC colleague, Ruvain Firestone, a great scholar, both a Reform rabbi and a historian of Islam, right? He travels the world representing Judaism to Islamic audiences, and he would be the person to ask that question of.
Hal, you have a question.
Yes, I'm wondering to what extent world trade in the Eastern Hemisphere drove the diaspora. The theory being that common language and basic ethical principles of honesty, not stealing, that put the Jews in a unique position to be agents of trade, and therefore that accelerated the diaspora.
Yeah, thank you, Hal. That's a really important point. First of all, every group that is in diaspora finds its way to commercial occupations, right? They're not rooted in the land. They're not coming out of that peasant tradition of working the land, right? So they have to find other ways to make a living. And more often than not, whether they're Syrian traders, Greek traders, Turkish traders, or Jewish traders, they find their way to trade, right? Now, as you pointed out, that will be further enabled by the fact that a Jewish merchant has a cousin or at least a co-religionist who speaks the same language in any number of other ports from which he wants to import or export. So it's facilitated by the Jewish dispersion. You're quite right. And the point I'd like to make here, building on your question, is that it's another perfect example of history and memory. What you shared with us is a historical understanding of why Jews gravitated so often throughout their history to commerce, right? My last name, Kaufman, means merchant, right? It's part of the Jewish experience. That's the history. What's our memory? What do we Jews tell ourselves about that? Oh, they forced us to be moneylenders. Now, there's some truth to that. But how often have you heard, or perhaps even said that the reason that there's a historical Jewish connection to money making is because it was a form of persecution that they forced us into being moneylenders, and that's the answer to that. Now, that might make us feel better. It might help. It might make us think that we're countering the anti-Semitic trope that Jews love money, or Jews are greedy, or Jews are whatever, right? But it misses the historical complexity that you, Hal, just suggested, and that I hope I've expanded on. So I would urge us all, that to remember that the historical record is helpful, is useful, right? In explaining both to ourselves, to our children, to our friends and neighbors. Yes, Jews, there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood, but there are reasons for that. Yes, there are a lot of Jews in business, but there's nothing insidious about it. It's a matter of history. And then the question is, what do you do with that? Right. So again, oops, Kofi just wanted to weigh in, I suppose. Okay. Any other questions or? Hello?
I am looking there's no other questions and that I can see, unless somebody wants to put up their hand while I'm reading here. Yes, look, Judy.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question, but I don't think this is the format. I'll ask it some other time because it's another topic. I wanted to thank you for this very interesting presentation. And you've mentioned or alluded to several different articles, and I'm wondering if you would provide that to us so we could follow up, because I really love history and I love tradition. But the comment I wanted to it's not a question, it's more like it's another issue, another day's topic. I'm concerned about Israel, as many of us are, about what's happening there. And I'm wondering if this could be some kind of turning point. My growing up was still collecting money for Israel and is planting trees and buying Israel bonds. And I don't hear that kind of conversation from the current generation. And I'm wondering if the turn to the right, extreme right, is going to make that schism greater? And that's just, I might not be able to be answered today.
I'll give you an answer. I mean,
Oh, you will.
Obviously, it's a
It's a big
question.
topic. It's a trip.
It's a topic near and dear to all of us, and a matter of concern for all of us.
Mhm.
My answer, it's a little glib, but I think it's still worth making this point. Is the enemy, or one of the vexing problems, I would call polarization. That over the course of time, we have been polarized between, when it comes to Israel, between pro-Israel and anti-Israel. And only those two extremes are valid. And the center, which necessarily has to employ nuance, has to embrace complexity, has to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, has been eroded.
Mhm.
And we tend to worry quite a bit about our kids off at college. What are they going to do when some anti-Israel person like verbally attacks them? And part of that worry is that we know at some level that they don't know what to say. And I want to suggest to you that it's our responsibility, our fault, if you will, that we haven't built that strong middle ground, that ability to say Israel is important. It exists and will continue to exist, and we support it. That's the pro-Israel side. But also, it has some problems that need attending, for which we bear responsibility. The Palestinians are not, to say it's not our problem is going to be self-defeating in the end, right? So I believe that middle ground. I grew up in a progressive liberal Zionist youth movement called Habonim, right? Movements like Habonim are almost gone. And part of the reason that I feel very saddened is that they represent a kind of a middle ground that no longer fits into this very polarized landscape. So I hope I'm not getting overly political in that answer, but I do think it's useful to understand how polarization is a problem in itself, and building the middle is a good solution. I hope that helped.
So our first question was with our Cal, and our last question will be with Cal. So Cal.
Yeah, so you covered a lot of ground. I'm going to give you an opportunity to cover some more ground if you can try to narrow my question a little bit. So after the Jewish diaspora exploded, the tradition in different countries in Europe were that Jews were accepted for a while. I'm grossly oversimplifying. Kings saw that Jews helped their local economy, paid a lot of taxes. Jews were welcomed into different kingdoms for a while. Then after a time, a later king or many later kings occurred, and the Jews were expelled. So they were welcomed in, stayed there for a while, flourished for a while, then were exiled and kicked out. And that's a gross oversimplification, but I think there's a decent amount of truth to that. And so could you comment on some aspect of that in terms of Jewish diaspora from the medieval period forward? So I'm asking you to pick some piece of that to talk about.
Well, if it's okay, Cal, I'll simply relate it to our theme today. So the memory tends to emphasize the expulsions, right? I mean, there was the first one from England, later that was in the late 11th century. 12th century, there were a number of expulsions from France and from Central Europe, and then, of course, culminating with the biggest, worst one, the expulsions from Spain and Portugal in 1492 and 1497. So, obviously, the question of the relationship of Jews to the governing powers something will go wrong, because those ruling powers, those kings, will say at some point, okay, enough of the Jews. We owe them too much money. Let's get rid of them, right? And so those expulsions take place. They are awful. The one out of Spain is particularly horrifying in that the Spanish Jewish community had been so settled for so long and had such an illustrious history. For that to come to such a sudden end was quite traumatic. But here's an example in which memory focuses and is selective on such events, right? Lots of Jews, such as you and many of us, have a good memory of those expulsions. What we don't then balance it with is the greater historical perspective, which then sees shifting demographic patterns across Europe, and the migration patterns of Jews through the centuries, of which those expulsions are only one small part, right? They provide one impetus for Jewish migration at one point or another, but Jews are always on the move, and Jewish communities and demographic concentrations of Jews are always shifting for one reason or another. I mean, certainly a major reason is Jews will move away from areas that they experience as oppressive and move to areas that they are more tolerant of them. And so that's the main reason for their moving. But, those shifts, those migratory patterns are something that are more ongoing, maybe a little less exciting, less dramatic than just a focus on the expulsions. But that would be my answer to you, that your question about the expulsions is an example of memory. And the way to kind of leaven that is by adding the greater historical context of Jewish settlement in Europe and in different areas of Europe throughout time. It's a complicated story. There's been a lot of work on it nowadays for genealogical reasons and questions of Jewish DNA and where contemporary Jewish DNA derives from and what regions. I'm sure many of you have read the series of articles that the Ashkenazi. There's now a new theory that Ashkenazim derive from just like a handful of people in one small area, Poland or the like, right? So those kinds of questions fill out the story and add and fill in the gaps in between those expulsions. And in general, I would say that persecutions of Jews, while certainly part of our history, are periodic. There are lengthy periods in between those persecutions where Jews are just living their lives. And as historians, we want to look at the whole picture and not just simply pluck out the bad moments. Right. So I hope that addressed your query. Do we have any other questions?
I don't see any other questions at this moment.
Okay.
I want to thank you very much for coming here and via Zoom and talking to us. This has been fascinating, just this general view of history. Tomorrow, of course, you're going to be looking much more microscopically at one time of Jewish history in the 1960s and about celebrity, and we are looking forward to that as well. And we want to thank you and wish everybody here a Shabbat Shalom, and tell your friends come again tomorrow. Yes, I can see lots of clapping. This will be on the Beit Aviv YouTube channel. So if somebody says to you, I wish I had been there, I heard it was fantastic, tell them to go to the YouTube channel and they can look at it in preparation for tomorrow or after they hear Dr. David Kaufman tomorrow. My friends, have a fantastic day.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much.
Has David left already?
He has.
He has, okay.
Trying to walk the dog.
Right.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you
See
very
y'all
much.
tomorrow.